The world of 1775 was one of profound uncertainty. For over a decade, a creeping fog of tension had settled over the 13 American colonies. It was a dispute, at first, of lawyers and legislators, of petitions and pamphlets. The question was simple, yet its answer remained terrifyingly elusive: what was the nature of an empire? Were the colonists, living 3,000 miles from London, free Englishmen with all the rights and representation that implied, or were they something else entirely, subjects of a distant crown whose will was absolute? This question was like a splinter in the mind of an empire. The British Parliament, victorious in the 7 Years' War but burdened by a mountain of debt, saw the colonies as a source of revenue. The colonists, who had bled on the battlefields of that very war, saw these new taxes, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, as a fundamental betrayal. It was a drama played out in crowded town meetings and hushed conversations in taverns, a drama of ideas. Men like Samuel Adams in Boston, with his genius for organization, and Patrick Henry in Virginia, with his fiery oratory, gave voice to the growing discontent. But words, however sharp, are not yet acts of war. The line between protest and rebellion is a thin, invisible one, and in the early spring of 1775, no one knew if that line had been crossed. To understand the mystery of the beginning, we must focus our lens on a specific place, a cauldron of this simmering conflict: Boston, Massachusetts. By 1775, Boston was an occupied city. Redcoats, the king's own soldiers, patrolled its streets, a constant, visible reminder of Parliament's authority. The people of the countryside watched their city with a mixture of fear and defiance. They had formed militia companies, the famous Minutemen, ready to act at a moment's notice. An intelligence network, as sophisticated as any the world had seen, was in place. Watchmen were posted on every road. The movement of every British soldier was noted, discussed, and interpreted. It was a world of whispers, of secret signals, of men and women playing a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. And this brings us to our first great character in this drama, a man cloaked in the very essence of this secret world, Dr. Joseph Warren. A handsome, charismatic physician in his early 30s, Warren was not just a healer of bodies, he was a leader of men, a major general in the Massachusetts militia, and the head of the Boston Committee of Correspondence, the hub of the Patriot Intelligence Network. He was the spider at the center of a web that stretched across the colony. From his home and his surgery, he received a constant stream of information, piecing together the intentions of the British commander, General Thomas Gage. General Gage was a man in an impossible position. A seasoned military officer with an American wife, he understood the colonists better than most of his peers. He was a soldier, ordered by his king to enforce the laws of Parliament, but he was also a man who dreaded the thought of civil war. He wrote to London, warning that it would be a formidable conflict, not a simple suppression of a rabble. But his warnings were ignored. He was ordered to act, to take a decisive step to crush the rebellion before it could fully ignite. The mystery for us, looking back, is not just what he planned, but what Warren knew, and when he knew it. General Gage's plan, forged in the secrecy of his headquarters, was elegant in its simplicity. He would send a force of his best troops on a silent march into the countryside. Their objective, the town of Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. There, it was believed, the colonists had amassed a large cache of military supplies, cannon, shot, powder, and provisions. Seize these supplies, disarm the rebels in one swift, bloodless stroke, and by doing so, demonstrate the irresistible power of the crown. And if they could also capture two of the rebellion's most vocal leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, known to be hiding in the nearby town of Lexington, so much the better. It was to be a surgical strike, a secret movement of troops in the dead of night. But in a world of whispers, can anything truly be a secret? The first glimmer of the plan escaped the confines of Gage's headquarters. Perhaps it was a careless word overheard by a loyalist servant, or a calculated hint dropped by an officer in a Boston coffee house. The exact source is lost to history, another piece of the mystery. What we know is that by the evening of April 18, 1775, Dr. Joseph Warren knew that the British were about to move. He knew the target was likely Concord. He had to act, and he had to act fast. And so, we come to the most enduring image of that fateful night, a signal. Warren arranged for a prearranged message to be sent to the Patriots across the river in Charlestown. It was a simple, binary code, visible for miles. He instructed Robert Newman, the sexton of the Old North Church, to hang lanterns in its steeple. 1 if by land, and 2 if by sea, the signal went. 2 lanterns would mean the British were taking the long water route across the Back Bay. 1 would mean they were marching out over the narrow neck of land connecting Boston to the mainland. The lanterns would be a beacon of warning, a spark of light in the darkness, seen by waiting eyes in Charlestown. It is a moment of high drama, a silent, urgent message flickering in the night, a desperate gamble to outwit an empire. But the signal was just the first step. Someone had to get the warning to Adams and Hancock in Lexington, and to the people of Concord. Warren summoned 2 men whose names would become legend. The first was William Dawes. A tanner by trade, Dawes was a trusted messenger, a part of the regular Patriot dispatch system. He slipped out of Boston just before the British military cordon was closed for the night, riding out over the neck, the very land route the British might take. He was a professional, reliable, and he got through. The second man was the one whose name would be etched into the heart of the nation's memory, Paul Revere. A silversmith, an artisan, Revere was also a crucial node in Warren's intelligence network. He was a writer, a courier, and a man of immense energy and determination. While Dawes took the land route, Revere had a more dramatic escape planned. He had friends across the river in Charlestown who would be watching for that signal. He had a rowboat waiting. Under the cover of darkness, he was rowed silently across the Charles River, slipping past the menacing bulk of the British warship HMS Somerset anchored in the stream. It was an act of immense personal courage. He landed in Charlestown, was met by his waiting contacts, and was given a horse. And then, just after midnight on the 19th of April 1775, Paul Revere began his famous midnight ride. It was not a solitary gallop through a silent countryside shouting a warning. It was a systematic, urgent mission. He rode from town to town, farmhouse to farmhouse, knocking on doors, spreading the word in a low, urgent voice: the regulars are coming out. He was not, as the myth would later have it, shouting a unified cry of rebellion, but delivering a precise, terrifying piece of military intelligence. He was a walking, breathing, 2-legged lantern, carrying the flame of warning from Boston to the sleeping farms of Middlesex County. By the time Revere reached Lexington, about midnight, he found the house where Adams and Hancock were staying. A young soldier named William Monroe was guarding the premises. Monroe, a disciplined man, asked Revere not to make so much noise, as the people in the house had just retired and wished for them not to be disturbed. To which Revere, with the urgency of his mission, famously replied, "Noise. You'll have noise enough before long. The regulars are coming out." He roused Adams and Hancock, who began to prepare for their escape. And then, a short while later, William Dawes arrived, having completed his own, less celebrated but equally vital ride. And finally, a third rider arrived, a young doctor named Samuel Prescott. Prescott, a resident of Concord, had been in Lexington courting his fiancée and, hearing the news, insisted on joining the mission. It is one of history's small, perfect ironies that the most famous ride to warn Concord was completed by a man whose name is far less known. You see, the story of the ride is not just about Revere. It's a story of a relay. As the 3 riders, Revere, Dawes, and Prescott, rode toward Concord, they were stopped by a British patrol. Revere was captured, questioned at gunpoint, and eventually released, but his horse was confiscated. Dawes was thrown from his horse and escaped back to Lexington on foot. But Prescott, knowing the local terrain intimately, spurred his horse over a stone wall and escaped into the dark woods, riding hard for Concord, carrying the warning to its destination. Because of Prescott, the military supplies in Concord were scattered and hidden by the time the British arrived. The mission, in its primary objective, had failed before it even began. But the night was not over. While Revere and Dawes and Prescott were riding, the British expedition was also on the move. About 700 elite British soldiers, grenadiers and light infantry, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, had been ferried across the Charles River under cover of darkness. Their march to Concord was a miserable one. They waded through freezing water up to their waists, their heavy woolen coats soaked through, their ammunition damp. They slogged through the muddy roads, slowed by the weight of their packs and the uncertainty of their mission. And as they marched, they began to hear a strange and unsettling sound drifting through the night, the ringing of church bells, the distant pop of warning guns. The countryside was awake. The element of surprise was gone. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, realizing their secret was out, sent a message back to Boston requesting reinforcements. Meanwhile, in the town of Lexington, the local militia company, about 70 to 80 men, farmers and tradesmen who had trained together, began to muster on their town common, or green, as the first gray light of dawn began to streak the sky. They were led by their captain, John Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, a man who knew the horror of combat. He was also a man, according to some accounts, racked with illness, perhaps tuberculosis. He stood before his men, a ragtag collection of neighbors and kin, armed with their personal muskets, facing an unknown future. What happened next on Lexington Green is the heart of the mystery. It is the moment the war began, and yet, in the chaos of the moment, no one could agree on exactly how it happened. We have the testimonies, later collected, from both the American militiamen and the British soldiers, and they tell two different stories. This is the historian's Rubicon. To cross it, we must weigh the evidence, listen to the echoes of the past, and acknowledge that some truths are forever obscured by the fog of war. As the sun rose, the British advance company, about 240 strong, under the command of Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, marched onto the green. They saw the small, ragged line of militia. Pitcairn, a respected officer, reportedly shouted out, "Disperse, ye rebels! Throw down your arms and disperse." Captain Parker, seeing the overwhelming force, saw the hopelessness of the situation. According to his own deposition, he immediately ordered his men, "Let the troops pass by, and don't molest them, without they being first." He told his men to disperse and not to fire. The militiamen began to break ranks and leave the green. They were not standing in a battle line, they were walking away, muskets in hand but not raised. And then, a shot rang out. No one knows for sure who fired it. A shot, a single, sharp crack in the cold morning air. To this day, we call it, the shot heard round the world. But in that moment, it was just a sound, a spark in a powder keg. The American witnesses claim that the first shot came from the British ranks, that a soldier, for whatever reason, accident, rage, panic, fired his weapon. The British witnesses claim they saw a flash from behind a wall or from the edge of the green, a shot from a colonist. Perhaps it was a nervous militiaman. Perhaps it was a bystander. Perhaps it was a stray shot from a British soldier's misfire. The mystery endures. But the result is not a mystery. After that single shot, there was a moment of terrible silence, and then a British officer, accounts differ on who gave the order, Pitcairn or another, shouted, "Fire! By God, fire!" A volley crashed out from the disciplined British line. It was not a single shot, but a massed, devastating blast of lead. Several Americans fell, killed or wounded. The rest scattered. The British, their discipline perhaps snapping in the stress of the moment, let out a wild huzzah, and then, without orders, some of them charged forward, chasing down and firing at the fleeing militia. In the chaos, a few more were shot in the back. When it was over, 8 American militiamen lay dead on the Lexington Green, and 10 more were wounded. Only one British soldier was wounded, a slight graze to the leg. The British column reformed and, leaving the dead and dying where they lay, continued its march to Concord. They had bloodied the rebels, but they had not cowed them. They had, in fact, done the opposite. They had transformed a political dispute into a bloody, tangible reality. The news of the shooting at Lexington flew ahead of the British column like a wind before a storm. When the British arrived in Concord a few hours later, they found a town that was prepared. The supplies were gone. They searched, and managed to destroy some cannon carriages and a few barrels of flour, but their primary mission was a failure. As they did so, a grim assembly of American militia was gathering on a ridge overlooking the town, at a place called Punkatassett Hill. They watched as smoke began to rise from the center of Concord. The British had set fire to some gun carriages and, accidentally, to the courthouse. To the watching Americans, it looked like the burning of their town. This was the second, and perhaps more significant, ignition point. As the smoke rose, the American militia, now numbering over 400 men, began to march down from the hill toward the North Bridge in Concord. They advanced in columns, a makeshift army, their hearts filled with a cold fury at the sight of their burning town and the memory of their slain countrymen at Lexington. At the North Bridge, a company of British soldiers was stationed. As the Americans approached, the British, perhaps fearing they would be overwhelmed, fired a few warning shots, and then a full volley. This time, the Americans did not run. Their leader, Major John Buttrick, is said to have shouted the first official order of the American Army: "Fire, for God's sake, fellow soldiers, fire." The Americans returned the volley. It was the first time Americans had fired on British soldiers in a formal engagement. Several British soldiers fell, including 4 of the 8 officers in the company. The British line wavered, broke, and retreated in confusion back toward the center of Concord. The colonists had now drawn blood. They had fired upon the King's Own. There was no going back. The British retreat from Concord to Boston, a distance of about 16 miles, became a nightmare, a gauntlet of fire that would sear itself into the British psyche. The countryside had risen. From behind every stone wall, from every barn and tree, militia men, the Minutemen and their neighbors, swarmed to the fight. They did not fight in the formal, European style of lined-up battalions. They fought as they hunted, using the terrain for cover, firing from concealment, then moving to a new position. It was a running battle, a brutal, savage, 8-hour-long slaughter. The British column, exhausted, thirsty, and low on ammunition, was cut to pieces. They were flanked, sniped at, and harassed every step of the way. Discipline began to break down. Men broke ranks to try and escape the withering fire, only to be cut down. Only the arrival of a relief brigade, sent from Boston under Lord Percy, saved Smith's force from total annihilation. Percy formed his men into a massive, mobile square, using artillery to keep the swarming militia at bay, and the shattered remnants of the original expedition were able to stumble back to the safety of Charlestown, under the guns of the British Navy. By nightfall, the British had suffered over 270 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. The Americans had lost about 90 men. But the true cost was not measured in numbers. It was measured in the unthinkable. The bridge was burned. The line was crossed. The mystery of what might have been, the path of negotiation and compromise, was now forever closed. A war had begun. In the days that followed, the news of Lexington and Concord spread like wildfire. Writers carried the story to every corner of the 13 colonies. The language they used was not of a skirmish, but of a massacre, of a brutal and unprovoked attack on peaceful farmers. It was propaganda, yes, but it was propaganda built on a foundation of truth. Blood had been shed. American blood. British blood. And from that blood, a new nation would, in time, be born. So, my friends, we have seen how a war can begin. Not with a declaration, not with a single, clear cause, but with a slow accumulation of tension, a web of whispers and secret signals, a desperate midnight ride, a shot in the dark that no one can explain, and the stubborn, terrifying courage of ordinary people who, when faced with the ultimate choice, chose to fight. The mystery of April 19, 1775, is not about who fired first. That question, fascinating as it is for trivia. The true, enduring mystery is the mystery of transformation. How did subjects become citizens? How did farmers become soldiers? How did a collection of disparate colonies begin to imagine themselves as one nation? It happened in the hush of that midnight, in the flash of that volley, and in the long, bloody march back to Boston. It happened because ordinary men and women, in a moment of profound crisis, chose to step into the unknown. And in doing so, they began to write one of the most extraordinary stories in all of human history. Friends, if you are interested in the true history of the United States without embellishment, subscribe to the Empire of Freedom channel. Click on the bell so you don't miss anything.